So there are many different ways that we engage with books, including having a hair in your face. Hi BookTube, I'm here today to talk about audiobooks, specifically asking the question, should audiobooks be considered reading? So there are many different ways in which we engage with books. You can read a physical book, you can read an ebook with your eyes, or you can listen to an audiobook. But the question is then, are audiobooks considered reading? So first of all, I'm going to talk about my experience with audiobooks. My relationship with them. The primary way I encounter audiobooks, that's actually on my commutes. So I work in home healthcare, so I do a lot of driving from house to house, from town to town sometimes, and out into the country in the middle of nowhere. My drives can take anywhere from 30 seconds to 40 minutes. So I spend a lot of time in the car, and I enjoy listening to audiobooks at that time. I found that the radio, or even just listening to my own music, kind of got repetitive because it was the same songs over and over and over again, and so I prefer to listen to audiobooks while driving because it's something different. And I also sometimes, if I'm working around the house doing cleaning and stuff, I like to listen to short audiobooks that I can listen to in like 2 or 3 sittings. Whereas when I'm in the car, it doesn't matter to me how long the audiobook is. So I like to use audiobooks to get through my TBR faster, and I find that audiobooks, I find they're also good for getting through larger and more intimidating books. It's easier to have someone read the book to you than to sit there for long periods of time and read it yourself. So longer series as well, I like to consume through audiobooks. And I also use it to kind of cheat on my wrapped books project. So if there's a book I really want to read and I can get it in an audiobook, even though I know I have it on my shelf somewhere, I'll go for the audiobook version if possible. I also tend to read a lot of science fiction and fantasy that way, because I find it's more plot and character based as opposed to not that it's doesn't have good writing, but the reliance is more on plot and character as opposed to just the writing. I'm not saying at all that science fiction and fantasy does not have great writing. Like, I can tell you right now that it does. But an initial approach I find to fantasy and science fiction is great through audiobooks. So I listened to the whole Wheel of Time series initially on audiobooks. And you can get the writing in the audiobook as well. Yeah, I tend to focus on plot-based books for audiobooks. And I also like to listen to nonfiction on audio because it feels like you're in a classroom, and I love school, and I think I'm one of the weird people that do still love school and learning that way. So it's kind of like having someone standing there and lecturing you, and I mean, I can't take notes while driving, but I still feel like I'm learning while doing that. What are the differences between reading on the page versus listening to a book? And here's where we're going to talk about whether audiobooks are really considered reading. While you can have your own personal opinion on this, let's remember that opinions and anecdotes do not disprove scientific studies, right? Let's state that right out there. And science says there is no discernible difference in comprehension between reading a book and listening to a book. So the most recent study was done by Gallant Lab, and I'll link that down below, and they did brain scans as people were visually reading a book, and then on people who were audibly reading a book. And looking at the brain scans and the data analysis afterwards, the researchers saw that the stories actually stimulated the same cognitive and emotional areas regardless of the medium in which they consumed their reading. So there's no difference in your brain of how it processes the language when you're reading physical with your eyes or audibly with your ears. So let's talk about the positives of audiobooks. First of all, the one positive that came first to mind was knowing how to pronounce names and places and the weird things that are made up in science fiction and fantasy especially. even if you can't spell them. So this is something I really truly encountered in Wheel of Time, which has some interesting character names. I'm gonna delve into an experience that you've probably had if you haven't read Wheel of Time series. Does anyone else remember, before the Harry Potter movies came out, before watching the Harry Potter movies, not knowing how to pronounce Hermione's name? I went through 3.5 books saying Hermione, and I'm thinking, who named their kid Hermione? It's kind of weird. And then in the 4th book, she explains to Victor Crumb how to pronounce her name, and I was finally, now I know how to pronounce his name. If I'd listened to the audiobooks, I would have known right from the beginning her name was Hermione and not Hermione. And it's interesting because I talked to people who have read Wheel of Time and they've read just the physical books, they haven't listened to the audiobooks, and the way they pronounce Nynaeve or Swan is very different than how the narrators pronounce them. And I'm assuming the narrators have the correct pronunciations because they would have been told. And the only downside to this I find is if you don't have a copy of the physical book, trying to spell those names. So for example, I remember trying to search about the Aiel, and I was somehow convinced in my head that there was an S in there somewhere, kind of like Isle. So I was trying to search for Aiel, and no matter how I spelled it, I couldn't get it right. But I knew how to pronounce it, so that's something. Number 2, the next positive is multitasking. So I think this is the most popular reason why people choose audiobooks, is because they can do something else while reading. So they free up your hands to do other things. So I do it while driving. You know, I can't read a physical book while driving. You know, I could, but I'd cause accidents, and we don't want that. You can do it while crafting or cleaning or cooking, you know, and this also gives you more time to read, because when you're doing those things, you generally wouldn't be reading physical books. So if you have an audiobook on, that's more reading that you can do. So even though you can't use your hands, you can still use your ears. And number 3, some books are just meant to be read out loud. There are some books that may actually be better experienced as audiobooks. So the most obvious examples are books that began as oral stories that have been transcribed through times. You know, fairy tales, legends. Specifically, the Iliad and the Odyssey began. So I'd like to apologize if the angle changed. My card was full, so I had to fiddle with the camera to fix that. So we're talking about how some books are meant to be read out loud, and I said specifically the Iliad and the Odyssey are books that need to be read out loud because they started that way, and I think they'd be best experienced that way. I also think that books written in dialect are also better experienced as audiobooks as well. I know that when I came to a certain section in Ulysses, that I used the audiobook to help me through it, because the words on the page weren't making much sense, but when I heard it spoken, it's like, okay, now I kind of get it. It made more sense to me to hear those words out loud. Memoirs, I think, especially if they're written by comedians, are best experienced as audiobooks as well, because the author's inflections and their comedic timing may not come across as well on the written page, but will come across in an audio version. Also, any book read by Michael Kramer and Kate Reading should be read as an audiobook. They did the Wheel of Time series, and Michael Kramer also is doing the Brandon Sanderson books as well. So definitely, if you're thinking about reading Mistborn, it's the only one I've listened to so far, but if you're planning on listening or reading the Wheel of Time or the Mistborn series, definitely do the audiobooks. They're really good. There's also some negative sides, of course, of audiobooks. Narrators' voices. Sometimes certain voices just kind of like grate on my ears, and I'm like, how did this person become like a professional narrator when their voice is not for me? It might just be my personal preference in how their voice is. And there's sometimes where it's not just a problem with their voice, like their voice may be really good, but their voice just doesn't absorb very well in my mind for some reason. I think I might have some sort of auditory processing disorder maybe when it comes to certain voices, that I just kind of like, they have a really nice voice. I didn't understand or comprehend a word of what they said, so I need a different narrator. Yeah. There's also the narrator's influence on the interpretation. And this might not be a negative thing so much as a thing that I think you should be aware of. So when they're reading a book, they're obviously going to have inflections and tones. Even the way the characters talk can influence how you interpret the book. I saw this example online, and it shows how different inflections change the meaning of a sentence. So the sentence is, she said she did not take his money. But if you read that in different inflections, you can see how it changes meaning. So for example, she said she did not take his money, which means she said it, not someone else. Versus she said she did not take his money, which means that it wasn't her who took the money, it was someone else. Or it could be, she said she did not take his money, but she might have taken someone else's money. So that one sentence can be interpreted in many different ways depending on how it's said, right? So it's just something to be aware of when you're reading, that the way a narrator reads it can affect your interpretation of the book. And lastly, you can't annotate audiobooks. I know some people are able to have the physical copy and listen to the audiobook at the same time, and that helps with annotating, obviously, because then they can write it down. But generally, when you're reading an audiobook, you're doing something else, and you don't stop to take notes or mark a certain passage. I mean, how are you going to mark a certain passage? I know I just stick my audiobooks on a USB key and stick them to the car and listen to it through the radio. So there's no way for me to annotate what I'm reading, and I really enjoy annotating. So I have found that with certain books that I've listened to as audiobooks, I want a physical copy so I can go through and annotate it. That's what I'm doing with the Wheel of Time series right now. That's what I want to do with The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, which I listen to on audiobook. I want to go through and I want to annotate these things. I want to engage with them more in that way. So yeah, should audiobooks be considered reading? In my opinion, yes, of course, they should be considered reading. According to science, yes, of course, they should be considered reading. Let me know what you think down below, and how do you engage with audiobooks? Thank you for watching.